We are going to go back to our focus on global trade. We've done an awful lot on technology actually today, an awful lot on AI, and it's very great to come back to the fundamentals of why we're here in Davos. And so the next 20 minutes looking at how regional trade hubs, which are ever increasing in size and power within the global economy, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are playing a pivotal role in linking the big continents such as Europe, Asia, and Africa together, of course, the United States. And in particular, the UAE, we had a fascinating conversation earlier on today, particularly about Abu Dhabi, so it's certainly something that's very much on our radar. We want to talk about what the outlook is for these regions and what it takes in terms of striving for diversity, promoting innovation and sustainability. So I would love to introduce you now to my two fantastic speakers on this panel. We have Sunil Kaushal, Regional CEO, Africa, Middle East of Standard Chartered. Good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you again.
You were here 2 years ago?
No, last year.
Oh, last year it was. You and I had a conversation last year.
Yes.
Great to see you again. And Dr. Adam Posen, who is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Great to have you as well on. Thank you so much for your time. So, Sunil, we had a great conversation last year, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
About your area being in charge of Africa and the Middle East, particularly when it comes to Standard Chartered. Can we just go back maybe and set the scene and talk about what's been going on? A huge amount going on in terms of the world economy, geopolitics, transitioning back after COVID. Where do you frame global trade right now, particularly for your region?
So trade, first of all, thank you for having me here.
Pleasure.
Great
to have
being
you
here
back.
for now the third consecutive year. Listen, global trade, it would be fair to say it got disrupted post-COVID and clearly got rerouted because the just-in-time model was severely challenged. And so it's found its way. It's found its way in creating new homes. And the geopolitics around US and China particularly, resulting in China plus one, being at the forefront of multinationals in terms of a hedge for their exports, it's very much in motion now. So you're seeing Vietnam, you're seeing Malaysia, you're seeing India, you're seeing Bangladesh for different products, Indonesia really becoming centers for production. And then we had the Ukraine war, which then exposed the vulnerability of really relying on a single source supply for your energy, which again meant the energy flows changed. What was Middle East moving into Asia started, particularly gas, started now moving more and more Middle East into Europe. And that was actually exactly the opposite, a decade or so back when it was all Middle East into the West. So it has changed, but trade is growing. Trade is growing, but geopolitics is a very sensitive one, like we saw in the Red Sea just in November and December with the risk of, passing through the Red Sea increasing, trade started going down. So we have to look at a whole complex area of factors when you talk about trade. But trade in our projections is going to grow from whatever 21 trillion at the moment, and Doctor will know better than me the numbers, to about 30 trillion by 2030. And it'll be led by Asia, Africa, and Middle East, because these are high growth regions.
We're seeing almost a new world order, aren't we, emerging?
It is.
In a decade.
It is absolutely. And when you start looking at the numbers, where West used to be the big supplier and the off-taker of commodities, has clearly shifted now towards, led by China, towards Asia. So those corridors have become large and the fastest growing, so overtaking the West.
But nevertheless, if you call it trade fragmentation, what are the implications then for the hubs, particularly the hubs which operate within your region? Because it's an area of great opportunity as well, isn't it, for these new hubs?
So the hubs, the traditional role of hubs was clearly transit points, bringing in bulk cargo and then breaking it up and then putting it into small markets. That continues. But with the manufacturing changing in terms of sourcing, what we see is these hubs now have to get into not only investing and keeping up with infrastructure and technology, but also expanding the sub-hub model. So they are now, if you look at you look at DP World in UAE, they are now a global organization. They have got semi-hubs sitting or smaller hubs, satellite hubs sitting in different parts of the world. And that's only going to increase. The second thing which they are doing is really take end-to-end control of the flows. So if you look at exports and imports, that comprises 10% of trade in terms of value for the movers. 90% is within the country. So now they want that pie as well. So these hubs are now getting very smart, using data, technology, to really do and give you an end-to-end service, door-to-door service. And that's a big change in the model.
It was fascinating listening to some very senior gentlemen from Abu Dhabi talk about what they're doing on the ground to attract investment, attract technology from all different sectors to the region.
And cutting-edge technology.
Absolutely. And also, and the regulation and everything else, making it as seamless as possible for investment to go into those regions. So are you surprised by the pace of innovation and change? I mean, are those hubs doing everything they can to kind of capitalize on the opportunity that's in front of them?
I think, of course, the more can be done, but they are at the cutting edge. They are absolutely at the cutting edge, whether it comes to, robotics, whether it comes to AI, how do you utilize your data, whether it comes to, really using blockchain, they're at the cutting edge of it. And if they have to remain relevant and efficient, I don't think they have much of a choice. Because in Asia, you've got equally efficient hubs as well. But this is applicable to all hubs. They're investing big time because there's competition, sprouting across the border.
Yeah. So there's definitely opportunities there, but we should talk about the trade barriers that exist. And Dr. Posen, I'd love to bring you into this conversation now. But firstly, please contribute to anything you've heard that is of interest to you before, but also in terms of trade barriers.
Well, thank you for having me with CNBC Catalyst. I think the important thing to note is how resilient and adaptive trade has been. So as you both mentioned, what we've seen is not so much a decoupling of China from the US or a reduction in Chinese trade or even exports to the US. It's moving. It's now going via Vietnam, via Indonesia, via Mexico. I mean, a figure that just came out the other day is the US actually now imports more from Mexico than from China. And that's because China has done so much shipment. Colleagues of mine at the Peterson Institute, Mary Lovely, Chad Bound, and others have looked at this, Richard Baldwin, and we kind of expected this. We knew trade was going to be resilient, but we didn't expect the adaptation to be so fast and so large. And this is the kind of thing that Standard Chartered's operations and these hubs are facilitating. That it's the ability to move production and to redo supply chains has been really striking. The other thing I would say, just picking up on what you've been saying, is the role of trade finance is critically important. We saw this during the 2008 to 10 financial crisis. Robert Zoellick, who was then president of the World Bank, saw ahead, he's on my board, full disclosure, but I admire him for doing this, saw ahead that trade finance would be interrupted and that would particularly hurt the developing world. And we had a natural experiment that certain regions were able to get trade finance continuing even during the financial crisis, and they did much better. So it just speaks to the combination of factors we need.
And that's a very important point.
Yeah.
That's a very important point because this is the supply chain finance, particularly for at the bottom of the chain, the SMEs, that becomes extremely important. And the only way you can do it, at least in our view, is by digitizing it and digitizing the credit process. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to provide capital or trade finance to the one who sits at the bottom of the chain. So hugely important, what we call the digital supply chain finance.
We were talking to your colleague Simon Cooper about that very issue this morning. There's still a lot of work to be done, but what is the potential for AME, for your region in particular, for unlocking the potential using supply trade finance?
It is, I think, when you look at what Middle East is trying to do in terms of diversifying their economy, in terms of bringing in light manufacturing, putting money into downstream production. What Africa is trying to do, or the new Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, or area now, no longer agreement, really you need to, if those have to be successful, those initiatives, you need to have the finance available. That's one of the biggest constraints in our surveys. It shows that having availability of finance is one of the biggest constraints, along with other infrastructure around payments and trade facilitators that are there. So the potential is huge. The intra-Africa trade, if I take the example of Africa, for instance, intra-Africa trade is only 16% versus 65% in Europe, versus 50% in North Africa. So potential is massive, along with the hard infrastructure which we are financing around standard gauge railways, etc. There is other infrastructure around payments, etc., which need to be, and supply chain finance, which is very, very critical.
Okay.
And if these are going to be the future growth engines, you need to have these building blocks in place.
I definitely want to talk about Africa in just a minute, but first, to you, Mr. Posen, first, Dr. Posen.
That's fine.
In your opinion, how can trade barriers be lowered? What are the solutions to kind of ease the flow of trade?
It's a great question, and I think right now the emphasis has to be on working around them, and that actually is part of the opportunity for the Middle East. That the U.S. and China governments are on this collision course. I don't mean, God willing, national security collision, but this economic friction. It's very hard in each country to unroll things once they've started. But as we've seen, ASEAN has cut out, and South Korea and Australia have cut out very large pieces of trade with both sides. The Middle East having the ability to take a longer-term perspective and a closer look at African, sub-Saharan African economies, as Standard Chartered is able to do, that is an opportunity that actually grows when China and the U.S. fragment. If China and the U.S. are busy going after the DRC specifically for some particular key mineral, that leaves aside all these other things, and there's money to be made.
And I think what they're doing is they're taking a neutral position and trying to convert this challenge into an opportunity. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the Middle East, they're trying to get into joint ventures with the Chinese and with the Asian manufacturers and create the country of origin within Middle East. So you have a Chinese partner who has a minority stake or whatever, 40% stake, manufacturing in Saudi or UAE and exporting as a UAE product, as a Saudi product. So that, and you maintain a neutral stance. I also believe, while carving out and getting into trade alliances like Asia has done more successfully, is the way forward. But FTAs, the FTA signing of FTAs is, I think, the way forward as well. And UAE has been particularly very successful. FTA with India, now the India, Middle East, Europe, the corridor which they're looking to develop. I think those are the right way forward and maintaining a neutral stance, in my view.
Would you agree?
I think FTAs have a critical role to play. I'm not sure. It depends on what economists and trade negotiators mean their quality, which is how many exceptions, how general is it. So this is why CPTPP is so important.
Yeah.
And the EU before that these are incredibly high quality agreements where you have to go a bit behind the border so that people are competing on a level playing field and there's a wide range of goods and services you can interact on. The thing I worry about, and I appreciate you're raising for this audience the issue of trade protectionism, is not just the protectionism, but the subsidies race. And that is going to make life much harder, I fear, for developing countries. That if the EU and the US and China and perhaps India, and maybe the UK, all decide we have to have our own green industry, we have to have our own chips industry, we have to have our own cars industry, and they threw trillions at it, there's very little room for the developing world to get ahead in those areas. And so that's where I start to worry.
And is that likely to happen? I mean,
I think it's already happening. Yeah. The question is, how far does it go? And how much does it cost? So I was presenting on a panel on industrial policy here at the WEF the other day, yeah. And the Deputy Director General, I forget her name, I apologize, from UNCTAD, spoke up about these issues. That even if the US, say Bidenomics, is well-intentioned for green purposes, it's not thinking through some of these other effects. But just bringing it back to what you were raising, the potential in Africa is there, has been there. We know there are success stories. We know that private finance, as Sushil said, is one of the key things lacking. And most of all, nobody's looking to them to build chips plants or EV plants. So there's plenty of room for them still.
Yeah. But I do feel that on the, particularly post-COVID and the Ukraine conflict, the essentials and national security items are being produced closer to home or within home. And that's resulting in some sort of, mini fragmentation. And it is very inflationary as well. So Bidenomics, the right thing to do, chips onshore, but there is a geopolitical angle to it as well. And one of the things that China did for decades was export deflation by producing every year the same thing at a lower price or a lower cost. Now that is being challenged as you take out pieces of the production and put it into Vietnam, you take pieces of the production and put it into India or wherever else or closer to your own home. So that's going to be inflationary. And the path to green, which is very important, is also inflationary. The carbon border adjustment tax, the border tax in EU is, at the initial years, going to be inflationary.
Yes. We're talking about that very issue in terms of Asia, China, with your colleague, Benjamin Hung, the CEO of Asia for Standard Chartered tomorrow. Just before we run out of time, I want to talk to you very quickly about Saudi Arabia. A hugely interesting proposition from a country that is really trying to change and attract investment. Just give me your thoughts on its positioning right now.
It's just unbelievable. I've been in the region in and out since '97, and what one is seeing and witnessing is real change in the last 4 years. Many of us were skeptics, whether this is going to happen, and are they biting too much, etc. But the pace of investment, the focus on execution, and the numbers they're talking about, even if they end up achieving 50-60%, and they're well on their way to executing. Riyadh, I was there all of last week in Riyadh. It's a different city. You couldn't find many restaurants in Riyadh now. Every top restaurant in the world is there. They got their branch there. Shopping malls, the social change, movie theaters, entertainment, it's at a different scale. Including the financial center that we're talking about. They're looking to develop that into a major regional hub. So the change is real, and I can think of course, on a much larger scale, something similar was what was happening in China in the late 80s, that pace of growth and investment. So very exciting. And we opened up 2 years ago, timing was perfect, and we've kind of dovetailed on that.
Posen, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it is incredible to think about what Saudi could be economically, because usually, as we were just saying about Africa, the constraint is usually financing. And it's not even just you don't have the money, it's that the lenders don't have enough trust in the system, don't have enough trust in the time horizon. Saudi Arabia, through a combination of luck and good stewardship, has this vast amount of wealth that they can free them up to do these longer-term investments. So if it is combined with domestic reform, their path is very high.
Yeah.
Additionally, as we keep talking about, they can choose to be open in the sense, I'm not speaking culturally or politically, that's not my field, but to be open economically, because in a sense, they don't have the competing domestic industries. They don't have a domestic sugar industry. They don't have a domestic auto industry. They can afford to be open, and that's like China in the 80s and 90s. Yep. It's to their benefit. So again, on the fundamentals, it's a very exciting prospect.
Yeah. Fascinating to watch it from the beginning, if you will.
Yeah.
And in closing, and I hate to kind of wrap up Africa in a summary, because of course it's a continent with many diverse different countries. I know that you have Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa as hubs. Can you give us an outlook briefly, Sunil, for your hubs within Africa?
Well, I'll talk about the continent, given that we have limited time. The continent, clearly, in terms of demographics, in terms of just the ability to go more downstream and value add is immense. And what we saw with the digitization, where they leapfrogged the analog kind of age and went into digitization as far as telecom is concerned, I think they can replicate in some part into their manufacturing. Today, 90% of their exports is commodities. And then they import the finished product by paying, the margins, etc. And we are seeing that change come through. One example is the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. Nigeria was not producing any petroleum product, being a petrostate. They used to export oil and then import at a substantially higher price petroleum products. That's going to stop. That's going to change. They're changing their payment system to facilitate payments within Africa rather than money going out to the to US and coming back. So what they call the pass. the Pan-Africa settlement system. So these are big changes. These are big changes. And Africa will be the source of manpower, just given the demographics of the future and of consumption as well. So we remain very constructive in Africa.
Okay, that's good to hear. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on. A round of applause, please, for Sunil Kaushal and Dr. Adam Posen. Thank you so much. It was very interesting.